stand at the center of Nihonbashi Bridge and look in both directions. Behind you, the city of Edo continues in the particular organized density of a capital that has grown to become one of the largest urban concentrations in the world by the middle decades of the Edo period, the castle at its center, the daimyo residences in their arranged districts around it, the merchant quarters and the artisan neighborhoods and the temples and the shrines and the countless smaller establishments that fill the space between the city's larger institutional structures. Edo is not a city that developed casually or according to the accumulated decisions of many generations of ordinary urban growth. It was organized deliberately, its geography shaped by the Tokugawa administration's requirements for defensibility, hierarchical order, and the visible display of shogunal authority at the center of a country that the shogunate intended to keep organized around that center for as long as the political arrangements that produced it could be maintained. Ahead of you, the road begins. Nihonbashi, the Bridge of Japan, is the official starting point of the Tokaido, the Eastern Sea Road, the highway that carries travelers from this bridge through 53 post stations to Kyoto, the imperial capital, across a distance of approximately 500 kilometers of varied Japanese terrain. It is also the starting point of the Nikko Kaido, the road to the great Tokugawa shrine complex at Nikko. And it is the reference point from which the distances on all 5 of the Tokugawa road system's major highways are officially measured. The 0 point of a national distance measurement system that organizes the entire country's official geography around this single bridge in the shogun's capital. This is not simply a bridge over a canal in a large city. It is a statement about how the Tokugawa shogunate understands the country it governs. Organized around Edo, measured from Edo, connected to Edo through a road network that the shogunate built, maintained, and administered as a system of political as much as physical infrastructure. The road that leads away from Nihonbashi carries an extraordinary variety of traffic in a normal day of the Edo period. Official government messengers, hikyaku, move along it at a pace that ordinary travelers cannot match, carrying documents, letters, and packages whose delivery timeline is measured in days rather than weeks, and whose organization is managed through a relay system at the post stations along the route. Daimyo processions move along it in the ceremonial order that the previous episode of this series examined in detail, their hundreds of participants consuming the road's capacity at the points where they pass. Merchants move along it with their goods and their commercial intentions, subject to the inspection and the documentation requirements that their social position and their merchandise generate at various points along the route. Pilgrims move along it in their distinctive clothing, carrying the religious identification that provides the social framework within which ordinary people can make journeys that might otherwise be difficult to justify to local authorities. The road ahead appears open. The bridge beneath your feet connects the capital to everything beyond it without any visible obstruction, the highway stretching away toward the first post station at Shinagawa in a condition of evident usability. There is nothing stopping a person from simply walking forward. And yet movement along this road for most of the people who travel it does not begin at Nihonbashi Bridge. It begins considerably earlier, before any physical step toward the highway has been taken, in a process of documentation and authorization that this episode will trace in detail. The road requires permission before it can be walked, and the permission must be obtained from sources that may be distant from the road itself. A traveler standing at Nihonbashi with all the physical capacity for the journey ahead, but without the documents the journey requires, is a traveler who cannot yet begin, regardless of the open road ahead. If you haven't already, like and subscribe to the Sleep-Inducing Historical Archive. Be sure to ring the bell for more boring content that we provide with great care. Settle in, as the road is long and there are checkpoints ahead. To understand what this journey actually involves begins here, at the bridge. The journey begins in paperwork, and the paperwork begins at home. For most people in the Edo period, the farmers who constitute the majority of the population, the artisans and merchants of the towns, the servants and lower-ranking members of samurai households, long-distance travel is not something that can be undertaken simply because the traveller wishes to undertake it and possesses the physical means to do so. It is something that requires a prior process of authorization, whose specific requirements vary by the traveller's social status, their place of residence, their destination, their stated purpose, and the various administrative layers between their immediate community and the authorities whose approval their journey requires. The village headman is often the first administrative figure whose knowledge and approval a farming household member requires before attempting to travel. The village is the fundamental unit of Tokugawa rural administration. It pays its taxes collectively, maintains its own internal order, and is responsible to the domain administration for the conduct and the whereabouts of its members in ways that make an undocumented departure by any household member a matter of potential concern to the headman responsible for accounting for the village's population. A farmer who leaves the village for a journey of any significant duration without the headman's knowledge and approval is creating a documentary gap in the village's administrative record that the headman may find difficult to explain to higher authorities if the matter is ever examined. Above the headman, depending on the specific domain and the specific destination, domain officials may need to be informed or may need to provide specific authorization for travel that crosses domain boundaries, which most significant journeys in Edo period Japan inevitably involve. A traveller moving from a village in one domain toward a pilgrimage site or a commercial destination in another must carry documentation that establishes their identity and their legitimate connection to their home community, and that explains the purpose of their crossing into territory administered by different authorities. The travel document, the tegata or the kanjo, is the physical object that performs all of these administrative functions simultaneously. It identifies the traveller by name and in some cases by physical description. It names the traveller's home village or district. It states the destination and the stated purpose of the journey. It names any companions travelling with the document holder. It may specify the expected route and the expected duration of the journey, and it bears the seal or the signature of whatever authority, the village headman, the domain official, the temple that organized the pilgrimage group, has certified that the traveller is who they claim to be and is travelling for the purposes they have stated. Pilgrimage deserves specific attention in this context because it represents the most widely available mechanism through which people who would otherwise have difficulty justifying long-distance travel could make journeys that the social and administrative system tolerated. The great pilgrimage destinations of Edo period Japan, Ise Shrine in the east, the pilgrimage circuits of Shikoku, the shrines and temples scattered across the country's geography, attracted travellers from across the country, and the pilgrimage provided both a socially recognized purpose for the journey and, in many cases, an organizational structure, the pilgrimage confraternity or the organized group, that provided the social framework within which individual travellers of modest status could move through administrative checkpoints more easily than they might as isolated individuals without clear institutional connections. The document that a traveller carries onto the highway is not simply a description of their journey. It is a promise made by someone with authority that the journey has been considered and approved, and that the traveller's presence on the road is not an act of autonomous individual movement, but a sanctioned extension of the administrative arrangements that govern the traveller's ordinary life. The road requires permission before it can be entered, and the permission is given by those whose authority over the traveller predates the journey and continues throughout it. The Tokaido on a busy morning carries an extraordinary variety of people along the same physical surface, and the variety of their legal situations is as great as the variety of their appearances. The samurai retainer traveling on official domain business moves through the highway system with a combination of visible authority and documented legitimacy that most other travelers cannot match. His weapons identify his social rank at a distance that makes many routine administrative encounters unnecessary before they begin. A visibly armed samurai traveling with the livery and the documentation of a recognized domain is a figure whose presence on the road generates a particular quality of official attention that differs in its character from the attention given to a merchant or a solitary pilgrim. His documents, when examined, confirm what his appearance already communicates. He is a person of official status conducting business that the Tokugawa administrative system recognizes as legitimate, and his movement through checkpoints and past official scrutiny is generally smoother as a result, though not entirely exempt from the documentation requirements that govern all travel in this system. The daimyo procession, as the previous episode of this series examined in considerable detail, moves through the highway system under its own elaborate set of regulations governing everything from the procession's route and schedule to the specific accommodation arrangements at post stations along the way. The procession is itself a form of documented travel at scale. The documents authorizing the Lord's movement, identifying his household's composition, and confirming his compliance with the alternate attendance requirement are maintained by officials within the procession and presented at checkpoints where they are examined against the records that the shogunate's own administrative apparatus maintains for each domain. The merchant occupies a more complicated position. Commerce is essential to the Edo period economy, and the movement of goods and merchants along the highway network is a practical necessity that the system accommodates, while simultaneously subjecting it to the inspection and documentation requirements that the merchant's lower social rank in the formal Confucian hierarchy makes applicable. A merchant traveling with significant quantities of goods may face examination of those goods at checkpoints that want to determine whether the cargo represents a legitimate commercial movement or something more problematic. The merchant's travel documents must establish the commercial purpose of the journey in terms that the administrative system recognizes as acceptable. Pilgrims, as already discussed, carry their religious purpose as a form of administrative protection, but that protection is not unlimited. A pilgrimage group whose composition or behavior deviates from the expected patterns of legitimate religious travel may attract additional scrutiny from checkpoint officials who must determine whether the religious identification is genuine or whether it is being used to provide cover for movement that would otherwise require different and more difficult documentation. Women traveling alone or in small groups without clear institutional affiliation occupy perhaps the most scrutinized position of any category of traveler on the Edo period highway. The reasons for this particular scrutiny are multiple, and this episode will address them in the context of the checkpoint system's specific concerns in the following section. But the general point is already visible. The road does not present itself to all travelers with the same face. The same physical highway, the same checkpoint structure, the same administrative requirements are experienced very differently depending on who is traveling. Social rank, institutional affiliation, the clarity of stated purpose, the quality of documentation, and the specific identity of the officials who happen to be on duty at any particular checkpoint all shape the experience of movement in ways that make the Tokaido not one road, but many roads experienced simultaneously by people whose legal situations differ enormously even when they walk the same path. The hierarchy that organizes Edo period society does not stop at the edge of the highway. It travels with every traveler, ahead of them and around them and behind them, shaping every administrative encounter the journey generates. The checkpoint appears in the road ahead of you at a point where the highway's geography has been chosen to make avoidance difficult. Hakone, the most famous of the major Tokaido checkpoints, sits at a mountain pass where the terrain on either side of the road is steep, forested, and practically impassable for a traveller with baggage and without local knowledge of the alternative routes through the mountains. This positioning is not accidental. The checkpoint is most effective when the traveller's alternatives to passing through it are genuinely limited, and the siting of major checkpoints in the Tokugawa road network consistently reflects an understanding of the landscape's role in making official scrutiny unavoidable. The physical structure of the checkpoint occupies the road at a point where the highway narrows between its flanking features. Mountains, rivers, walls, or constructed barriers that channel movement through the official gate. A guardhouse or inspection building stands beside the gate, staffed by officials whose specific duty is the examination of travelers and their documents. Depending on the checkpoint's importance and the volume of traffic it handles, there may be waiting areas where travelers accumulate while the inspection process works through the queue ahead of them, and holding spaces where travelers whose situation requires more extended examination can be kept while the officials decide what to do with them. The encounter at the checkpoint follows a procedural form that travelers who use the highway regularly learn to anticipate. Documents are presented. The official examines the document against whatever records or criteria he is applying. A list of known suspicious individuals, a register of expected official parties, his own assessment of whether the document's appearance and the traveller's appearance are consistent with each other. Questions may be asked. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? What is your business there? Who authorized this document? The traveller answers, and the official assesses the answers against the documents and against his own judgment about whether this particular person's story holds together in a way that justifies passage. The official's authority in this encounter is real, and it is not primarily subject to immediate appeal. He can delay the traveller while additional inquiries are made. He can examine baggage in more detail than a routine inspection would require. He can question travelling companions separately to see whether their accounts of the journey's purpose are consistent with each other. He can decline to pass the traveller through and refer the matter to superior officials for resolution, which may take hours or days. None of this requires an accusation of specific wrongdoing. It requires only the official's assessment that something about the traveller's situation warrants further scrutiny, and that assessment is his to make within the authority the checkpoint position grants him. For the vast majority of travelers, this encounter is brief and routine. The documents are in order, the stated purpose is credible, the traveller's appearance and behavior are consistent with what the document says about them, and the official waves them through. But the brevity and the routine character of the majority of checkpoint encounters does not diminish the authority that the encounter represents. The checkpoint transforms the journey from a private act of movement into a formal encounter between the individual and the Tokugawa state, conducted at a specific physical location where the state has placed officials for precisely this purpose. The traveller does not simply walk through the mountains to Kyoto. They walk through a series of official encounters, each one a moment in which the state's authority to regulate movement is exercised, and the traveller's permission to continue is renewed. Among all the things that checkpoint officials in the Edo period are trained to watch for, two categories of concern sit at the top of the hierarchy of official anxiety. The phrase that has survived in historical accounts of the checkpoint system, Iri Depo Nide Onna, incoming guns and outgoing women, condenses into 6 syllables the two movement patterns that the Tokugawa system understood as politically most dangerous and therefore most worthy of rigorous checkpoint scrutiny. Understanding why requires returning briefly to the political logic that the alternate attendance system established and that the previous episode of this series examined. Weapons moving toward Edo represent the most direct conceivable preparation for military action against the shogun himself. The capital is the seat of Tokugawa authority, and the shogunate's security depends upon Edo remaining a city into which military forces and weaponry do not flow without official authorization. A large quantity of weapons moving toward the capital along the Tokaido outside of any legitimate official procession context would be, if allowed to reach its destination, potentially catastrophic for the political order that the checkpoints exist to protect. The checkpoint system's scrutiny of weapons is therefore not primarily about ordinary travelers who might carry a personal weapon for protection. It is about the detection of organized military movement that would represent an actual threat to the shogunal government. The concern about women moving away from Edo operates on a completely different but equally consequential political logic. The daimyo's wife and family reside in the Edo Yashiki compound under the alternate attendance system, and their presence there is the human mechanism through which the shogunate maintains its leverage over the lord's continued compliance with the system's requirements. A lord who is contemplating defiance, military action, or any form of political resistance to the shogunate would have compelling reasons to extract his family from the capital before initiating whatever action he was planning, because the family's safety in Edo would be immediately compromised by any open break with the shogunate. The departure of a daimyo's family members from Edo without proper authorization is therefore not a private family matter. It is a potential early indicator of political preparation for conflict with the central government. This is why the checkpoint system applies particular scrutiny to women traveling away from Edo. The official at the checkpoint must determine whether the woman before him is who she appears to be, whether she is a commoner making a legitimate journey for the purposes her documents state, or whether she might be a domain family member attempting to leave the capital in circumstances that her documentation does not fully or honestly describe. The examination this determination requires is intrusive by any measure. It may involve questioning about identity, family connections, destination, the identity of accompanying persons, and the specific authorization for the journey provided by whatever official or household head is responsible for the traveler's movement. The reach of this system into the ordinary lives of women traveling the Tokaido is considerable. A woman who is genuinely a commoner with entirely legitimate travel purposes may find herself subjected to examination procedures that treat her journey as a potential political event, simply because the checkpoint's officials cannot immediately verify that her situation is as straightforward as it appears. The system's logic is impeccable from the shogunate's security perspective. The cost of missing a politically significant departure is so much higher than the cost of inconveniencing ordinary travelers that rigorous examination of all departing women from Edo is the rational policy, regardless of how that rigorous examination feels from the individual traveler's perspective. Step off the checkpoint scrutiny and into the organized commercial and logistical activity of the post station, and the character of the highway system shifts from its administrative and regulatory face to something more immediately practical and more visibly human. The post station, Shukuba, is the infrastructure that makes the highway's actual function as a transportation system possible. Between Edo and Kyoto alone, the Tokaido passes through 53 official post stations, each one a designated community with specific obligations to provide transportation services, accommodation, and logistical support to the traffic moving through it. These 53 stations, the subject of some of the most celebrated imagery in the entire Ukiyo-e tradition, depicted by Hiroshige in his famous series of prints that captured each station's specific character and atmosphere, represent a systematic organization of the highway's human infrastructure across its full length. The horse relay system that the post stations maintain is among their most operationally significant functions. Official travelers, government messengers, daimyo retainers on official business, court nobles and their servants have access to organized relay services through which tired horses are exchanged for fresh animals at station intervals, allowing official travel to proceed at speeds that personal horse ownership and management alone could not sustain across long distances. The horses available at each station are maintained as a public obligation by the local community, whose residents are required to provide a designated number of horses and human porters for official use, a requirement that constitutes a form of labor tax levied in the form of transport services rather than rice or money. For daimyo processions passing through, the post station's obligations become considerably more demanding. The hundreds of participants in a major procession require accommodation, food, fodder for the horses, storage space for the baggage, and the various other services that a large organized party requires after a day's travel. The honjin, the principal designated lodging for high-ranking official travelers, must be prepared to receive the lord and his senior household members at a standard appropriate to the lord's rank, while the various grades of accommodation in the wider station community provide for the different ranks of the procession's participants, according to the hierarchical sorting that governs every aspect of Edo period social life. Notice boards erected at prominent locations within the post station display information that the shogunate wants to communicate to the traveling public. Official regulations governing travel, prices that transportation services are authorized to charge, prohibitions and instructions relevant to the specific station's location and function. These boards make the post station not only a point of logistical service, but a point of official communication, a place where the shogunate's administrative presence reaches individual travelers in the form of posted regulations that they are expected to read and comply with. The business generated by the post station for the local community is substantial, and in many cases the primary economic foundation of the station community's existence. Inns, eating establishments, horse handlers, porters, guides, vendors of food and supplies, craftsmen who repair equipment and clothing damaged during travel. All of these represent livelihoods that depend entirely on the continued movement of traffic through the station. The same official travel requirements that impose obligatory service duties on local residents also generate the commercial activity that makes those residents' own economic lives possible. The post station is both burdened by the highway system and sustained by it simultaneously. The road ends at the water's edge, and here the traveller discovers that movement along a Tokugawa highway sometimes depends on factors that no document can resolve and no official authorization can override. The Oi River, which the Tokaido crosses between the post stations of Shimada and Kanaya in what is now Shizuoka Prefecture, was one of the most consequential points on the entire highway during the Edo period. Not because it was particularly wide or deep under normal conditions, but because it was a river without a bridge at which travel regulations specifically prohibited the construction of a bridge, and whose flooding during periods of heavy rainfall could suspend crossing operations entirely for days at a time, while travellers accumulated in the adjacent post towns and waited for conditions to improve. The decision not to build a permanent bridge at this and other major crossings on the Tokaido was not simply an oversight or an economic judgment about the cost of construction. It reflected the same logic that governed the checkpoint placement in mountain passes, that natural barriers serve the administrative function of controlling and channeling movement through manageable points where supervision and intervention are easier than on open roads. A permanent bridge that any traveller can cross at any hour regardless of official supervision is a different kind of infrastructure from a supervised crossing where ferrymen and officials control the transition from one bank to the other. The Tokugawa administration's preference was for the latter. Under normal river conditions, the crossing operation at the Oi and comparable rivers involves a well-organized system of river workers, kachiwatashi porters who carry travelers across shallow sections on their shoulders or on board supported platforms, and ferries for deeper crossings, whose work is organized by local officials who manage the crossing service as an official function with regulated prices and procedures. The number of workers available at any crossing, the prices they charge for different categories of service, and the priority given to different categories of travellers in the queue when demand exceeds immediate capacity are all governed by official regulation rather than by simple market dynamics. When the river floods, the crossing operation stops, and the decision about when conditions have returned to safe crossing standards is made by the crossing officials rather than by the travellers waiting to cross. A traveller who judges that the river's current condition is passable does not simply wade across. The crossing is a supervised operation, and unauthorized crossing attempts are both dangerous and irregular from an administrative standpoint. The traveller waits, and the post town behind them fills with other travellers who are also waiting, and the waiting may last for hours or for days, depending on the rainfall's intensity and the river's particular drainage characteristics. The flooding river makes visible something that is usually invisible in the highway system's normal operation. The degree to which movement along the Tokaido is not simply a matter of physical capacity and personal will, but a matter of permission, supervision, and circumstances outside the traveller's control. The document in the traveller's pocket authorizes the journey but does not authorize the crossing. The crossing depends on the river, and the river depends on the weather, and neither the river nor the weather is subject to shogunal ordinance. The traveller who has obtained proper documents, passed through the checkpoints, secured accommodation at the appropriate grade of inn at the post stations along the route, and managed the river crossings without significant delay, has done something that the Tokugawa system approves of, requires of them, and in the process of requiring has made very expensive. The financial structure of travel along the official highway network in the Edo period is layered and cumulative in ways that add up significantly across the full length of a major journey. The inn charges for accommodation and meals, and the rates vary by the grade of accommodation appropriate to the traveller's rank, by the season and the degree to which the inn is in demand during the traveller's visit, and by the specific post station's location and its relationship to the surrounding traffic conditions. A station that handles particularly heavy official traffic may have commercial relationships that make its pricing less flexible for ordinary travellers who lack the negotiating position that official status provides. Transportation costs along the route add to the accommodation charges. The horse relay service available to official travellers at post stations carries regulated charges that are in principle controlled but in practice variable depending on the demand at any specific station on any specific day. Porter services for baggage, the physical carrying of goods and equipment by human bearers who provide the labour that the system requires at stations where replacement animals are not readily available, represent another category of cost that accumulates across a journey of many stages. The river crossings charge separately, their fees regulated in principle, but subject to variation that reflects the crossing official's assessment of the demand, the difficulty of conditions, and the category of service required. A traveller who needs to be carried across on a platform rather than wading independently pays more than the wader, and the decision about which service is appropriate may be influenced by factors that are not entirely the traveller's own to determine. Delays add to everything. A river crossing suspended for 3 days of flooding means 3 additional nights of accommodation, 3 additional days of meals, and 3 additional days' worth of whatever incidental expenses the post town's commercial environment generates for a traveller with time to fill and the need to eat and sleep. These delay costs are not reimbursable from any official source for ordinary travellers. They are simply the additional cost of a journey that the natural environment has extended beyond its planned duration. The system benefits the communities that serve it, the inns, the horse handlers, the porters, the ferrymen, the vendors of food and supplies and walking sandals, and the 100 other things that travellers need and consume along the route. The highway is genuinely a source of economic vitality for the communities it passes through, and this economic dimension of the road network is one of the reasons why the shogunate's investment in road maintenance and the post-station system was sustainable across the Edo period's duration. Permission to travel along the official highway does not guarantee an easy journey. It only guarantees that the traveller has the right to begin paying for one, and the payments accumulate with each post station, each river crossing, each night of lodging, and each day of delay that the journey requires. Not every traveller who enters the Tokaido at Nihonbashi emerges from every checkpoint with their documents approved and their passage authorized, and not every person who wishes to travel between Edo and Kyoto, or between any two significant points in the Edo period's Japan, possesses the documents, the social standing, the credible stated purpose, or the patience for official scrutiny that the approved route requires. The mountain paths and forest tracks that parallel the major highways, and that in some stretches run close enough to the official road to be easily accessed by someone who wants to bypass a specific checkpoint while rejoining the main route after the checkpoint is passed, were known to exist and known to be used. Local people with detailed knowledge of the terrain around specific checkpoints, particularly at mountain passes where the official road's geography was most deliberately confined to make avoidance difficult, sometimes served as guides for travelers who wanted to navigate around official scrutiny for whatever reason brought them to that decision. The reasons for wanting to avoid the checkpoint were as varied as the travelers who attempted it. A person with debt obligations who feared that their creditors had communicated their description to checkpoint officials seeking to locate them. A traveler whose documents were irregular in some way that they judged would not survive checkpoint examination. A woman whose movement away from Edo would be scrutinized in the way the previous section described and whose journey she wished to make without that scrutiny. A person from a social position that made document acquisition difficult and who had therefore not obtained the required authorization before reaching the highway. Evasion was not straightforward, and the people who attempted it did so in the knowledge that the risks were real. Unofficial mountain paths through the terrain around places like Hakone were difficult to navigate without local guidance, and guides who provided that service were themselves taking on risk by doing so. The communities around major checkpoints were themselves under administrative obligations to report strangers moving through the area in ways inconsistent with legitimate travel, which meant that the alternative routes were not invisible to local observation even when they were invisible to official checkpoint scrutiny. The absence of documents that would normally be presented at inns along the route made finding accommodation more difficult, since inn operators had their own administrative obligations regarding their guests that an undocumented traveler complicated. The existence of checkpoint evasion is evidence that the Tokugawa control of movement, while extensive and generally effective, was not and could not be perfect. The country's geography is too varied and too extensive for any administrative system to monitor every footpath and every mountain track with the thoroughness that would be required to eliminate the possibility of unofficial movement entirely. The system's response to this limitation is not to attempt the impossible, but to make unauthorized movement sufficiently risky and sufficiently difficult that the great majority of travelers find the official route, with all its documentation requirements and checkpoint encounters and financial costs, preferable to the alternative. The state cannot watch every path, so it makes the unwatched paths dangerous enough that most people stay on the road. Pause and reflect on the individual traveller, the specific checkpoint, and the particular river crossing. Now, look at the full system that all of these elements together constitute. The Tokugawa road network, considered as a whole, the 5 major highways radiating from Nihonbashi, the post stations at regular intervals along each route, the checkpoints at strategic locations monitoring the flow of people and goods, the river crossings managed by official workers, the inns organized by grade to accommodate travelers of different social ranks, the document system connecting each traveler's movement to their home community, their social position, and their authorized purpose. This network is not simply infrastructure for physical movement. It is a system of social legibility, a mechanism through which the shogunate makes the movement of people through the country's geography observable, categorizable, and subject to administrative management. A traveler moving along the Tokaido from a village in Mikawa province to the pilgrimage destination at Ise is, within this system, not simply a person walking a road. They are a documented individual whose departure from their home community has been authorized by named officials, whose identity has been confirmed at successive checkpoints, whose accommodation at each post station has been recorded in the inn's guest register, and whose arrival at their destination and return to their origin are expected within a time frame that the documents governing their journey implicitly establish. Every stage of the journey connects the traveler to the administrative structure of Tokugawa, Japan in ways that make their movement legible to that structure even when no official is physically watching them at any specific moment. The roads themselves organize the country around Edo in a way that reinforces the shogunate's political geography. All major distances are measured from Nihonbashi. Official communications, tax revenues, and administrative directives flow along the same routes that daimyo processions and merchant caravans and pilgrimage groups travel, making the road network simultaneously a commercial, ceremonial, administrative, and surveillance infrastructure. The road connects everything to everything else through the capital, ensuring that the political logic that places Edo at the center of the country is also the geographic logic that places Edo at the center of the country's movement. Post stations transform the landscape between Edo and Kyoto into a series of manageable stages, each one a known distance from the next, each one equipped with predictable services and subject to consistent regulations. The traveler who knows the Tokaido knows not just a road, but a sequence of controlled environments, each one organized according to the same administrative principles as the one before, each one part of a single coherent system that extends from the first bridge in Edo to the final approach to the imperial capital. Checkpoints turn travelers into identities. The person who approaches a checkpoint is a physical body moving along a road. The person who passes through it, or is detained at it, or turned back by it, is a documented individual whose movement has been officially examined and officially resolved. The checkpoint is the mechanism through which the administrative system reaches into the physical flow of movement and converts it into the administrative categories: authorized or unauthorized, legitimate or suspicious, verified or requiring further examination, that the Tokugawa system needs to manage a country of this size and complexity. The traveler leaving one post station now, walking toward the next checkpoint on the road ahead, carries all of this with them: the documents in their travel bag, the record of their checkpoint passages, the administrative identity that the system has constructed around their journey and that will follow them to their destination and back again to their home. The road remains open beneath their feet, and the next stage is clearly marked, and the walking is simply walking. But every mile ahead still carries conditions, and arrival at the destination depends not only upon the traveler's endurance and direction, but upon remaining at every checkpoint and every post station and every river crossing verified. The next post station is visible in the distance, its rooftops emerging from the pines along the road's edge. You stand for a moment where you are, the last checkpoint behind you, its gate closed again after your passage, The road ahead open and unmarked and waiting for your feet. The mountains on either side hold their position. The document in your bag carries its seals and its authorizations and the name of the official who decided your journey could begin. This is the system that made a country mobile by making movement conditional, where the open road ahead was always also a road that someone else had already decided you were permitted to walk. If you'd like to return, the archive is always open and at your service.